The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Devonshire like a gossamer veil, shrouding Ravenshollow Palace in an ethereal beauty that seemed almost otherworldly. Lady Evangeline Ashworth stood before the ornate mirror in her chambers, her emerald eyes reflecting a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed anxiety. The ivory silk of her wedding gown cascaded around her like liquid moonlight, adorned with delicate pearls that caught the pale September sunlight filtering through the tall Georgian windows. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Lady Margaret Ashworth whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she adjusted her daughter's auburn curls beneath the family's ancestral veil. The older woman's green eyes, so similar to Evangeline's, glistened with unshed tears of pride and worry. Evangeline's fingers trembled as she touched the emerald necklace at her throat, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Ashworth women. "Do you think he truly loves me, Mama?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, revealing the vulnerability she'd been desperately trying to hide. Margaret's expression softened, and she took her daughter's hands in hers. "Lord Pemberton is a respected gentleman from an honorable family. Love will grow with time as it did for your father and me." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret couldn't shake the unease that had been gnawing at her since the engagement was announced. Henry Pemberton had always struck her as too polished, too calculating, though she'd never voiced these concerns to her daughter. The chapel bells of Ravenshollow began their melodious toll, echoing across the manicured gardens where roses bloomed in defiant splendor, despite the approaching autumn. Guests had been arriving since dawn, the cream of English society, dressed in their finest silks and satins, their carriages lined up like glittering beetles along the circular drive. In the chapel, over 300 of England's most influential families waited expectantly. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across the ancient stone walls, while arrangements of white roses and baby's breath perfumed the air with their delicate fragrance. The Archbishop himself had come to perform the ceremony, a testament to the importance of this union between two of Devon's most prominent families. As Evangeline made her way down the marble corridors of Ravenshollow, her silk slippers whispered against the polished floor. Portraits of long-dead ancestors gazed down at her with painted eyes that seemed to offer silent encouragement. The weight of generations of expectations pressed upon her shoulders, yet beneath her composed exterior, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. At the chapel doors, she paused to take one final breath. Through the carved oak panels, she could hear the gentle murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk, the expectant hush that falls over a crowd waiting for spectacle. Her father, Lord William Ashworth, appeared at her side, resplendent in his midnight blue coat adorned with the family's ceremonial decorations. "Ready, my darling?" His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen much of life, but his eyes held nothing but love for his only child. Evangeline nodded, not trusting her voice. The great doors swung open with a sound like a sigh, and she stepped into what should have been the most joyous moment of her life. The chapel stretched before her like a tunnel of expectant faces, all turned toward her with polite smiles and curious eyes. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in jeweled patterns of amber, ruby, and sapphire. The organ began its stately progression, and every head turned to watch her approach the altar. But as her eyes sought the figure who should have been waiting for her at the front of the chapel, Evangeline's heart plummeted into her silk-clad stomach. The altar stood empty save for the Archbishop, who looked as confused as she felt. Lord Henry Pemberton was nowhere to be seen. A collective murmur rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Lady Margaret's face went pale as porcelain, while Lord William's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. Evangeline stood frozen in the aisle, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her grasp as the awful truth crashed over her like a cold wave. She had been abandoned. The whispers grew louder, more pointed. She could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes upon her, could sense the mix of pity, scandal, and barely contained excitement that such drama brought to otherwise predictable lives. Some faces showed genuine sympathy, while others couldn't quite hide their satisfaction at witnessing such a spectacular fall from grace. "Where is Lord Pemberton?" someone whispered loudly enough to carry. "Perhaps he's been delayed," came another voice, though it lacked conviction. Evangeline's world began to spin. The chapel's grandeur seemed to mock her now, all this preparation, all this expense, all these expectations, for nothing. She was 22 years old, well past the age when most young ladies married, and this had been seen as her last real chance at a respectable match. Now, in front of everyone who mattered in Devon society, she faced not just humiliation, but social ruin. Her legs felt weak and she feared she might faint right there in the aisle. The emerald necklace at her throat felt like a noose, and her elaborate wedding gown suddenly seemed ridiculous, like a costume for a play in which she'd forgotten her lines. Just as the murmurs threatened to become a roar, and just as Evangeline thought she might collapse under the weight of her shame, a tall figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the chapel. He moved with predatory grace, his footsteps silent on the stone floor, despite his considerable height. The stranger was dressed in elegant black from head to toe, his coat perfectly tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and lean build. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd just dismounted from a hard ride, and a small scar above his left eyebrow gave his handsome face a dangerous edge. But it was his eyes that captured everyone's attention. Steel blue and penetrating, they seemed to see everything and judge nothing as they swept over the stunned congregation. When his gaze met Evangeline's, she felt a jolt of electricity run through her entire body. Without hesitation, the mysterious stranger strode down the aisle with purposeful steps. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, their whispers dying on their lips. There was something about his presence that commanded respect and silence, an aura of danger barely contained beneath genteel manners. He stopped directly beside Evangeline, so close she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to him. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not merely blue but flecked with silver, like storm clouds shot through with lightning. "Lady Evangeline," he said, his voice deep and rich as aged whiskey, carrying just enough volume for the entire chapel to hear. "I believe you find yourself in need of a groom." The chapel fell into absolute silence. Even the birds outside seemed to have stopped singing. Evangeline stared up at him, her green eyes wide with shock and something else she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition of something familiar in those storm-gray depths. "I am Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravencrest," he continued, turning slightly to address the congregation as well as her. "And if Lady Evangeline will have me, I would be honored to stand as her husband before God and this assembled company." The gasps that echoed through the chapel were audible now. The Duke of Ravencrest was legendary, a war hero who had distinguished himself in the Napoleonic campaigns, a man of immense wealth and mysterious reputation who rarely appeared in society. Some whispered that he was cursed, that tragedy followed him wherever he went. Others claimed he was the most eligible bachelor in all of England, if only he could be persuaded to take a wife. Evangeline's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Dukes didn't simply appear out of thin air to rescue ruined ladies from social disaster. Such things belonged in the romantic novels she read in secret, not in real life. But Alexander Blackwood was very real and very close, and very much waiting for her answer. She looked into his eyes and saw something there that Lord Pemberton's had never held. Genuine kindness, and beneath that, a pain so deep it called to her own wounded heart. Whatever his reasons for this unprecedented offer, she sensed they came from a place of understanding rather than pity. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Say yes, Lady Evangeline. Let me give you the wedding you deserve and save us both from the gossips' tongues." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability hidden beneath the commanding exterior, that made her decision for her. "Yes," she breathed, then louder so the entire chapel could hear. "Yes, Your Grace. I will marry you." The explosion of whispers that followed was like thunder after lightning. This would be the scandal of the decade, a duke appearing from nowhere to claim a bride abandoned at the altar. But it would be a romantic scandal now, not a pitying one, and that made all the difference. Alexander offered her his arm, and she took it gratefully, feeling strength flow from him into her trembling limbs. Together they approached the altar where the archbishop waited, his lined face showing amazement at this turn of events. "Your Grace," the elderly clergyman said carefully, "this is most irregular. The banns have not been read for you. The license bears another man's name. The license can be amended." Alexander replied calmly. As for the bans, I believe in circumstances such as these, exceptions can be made. Unless, of course, you would prefer Lady Evangeline suffer further humiliation for the sake of bureaucracy. The Archbishop glanced between them, then at the expectant congregation, and finally at Lady Margaret, who had recovered enough to nod her approval. Whatever questions this unusual arrangement raised, they could be dealt with later. For now, a young lady's reputation hung in the balance. Very well, he said at last. If both parties consent freely to this union, we do, Alexander said firmly, while Evangeline nodded, still too overwhelmed to trust her voice. As the familiar words of the marriage ceremony began, Evangeline found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. His profile was strong and aristocratic, his jawline defined beneath skin that spoke of time spent outdoors rather than in drawing rooms. When he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure, as if he meant every word despite the extraordinary circumstances. When it came time for the ring, he surprised everyone by producing an exquisite emerald surrounded by diamonds, a piece so beautiful and obviously valuable that it drew gasps from those close enough to see it. As he slipped it onto her finger, his touch was gentle, his larger hand enveloping hers with surprising tenderness. With this ring, I thee wed, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. With my body, I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods, I thee endow. And then, before she quite knew how it had happened, Evangeline found herself married to a man she'd never met, whose very existence had been unknown to her an hour ago. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander lifted her veil with careful hands and leaned down to kiss her. It was meant to be a ceremonial kiss, brief and proper for such a public setting. But when their lips met, something electric passed between them. A recognition, a promise, a glimpse of possibilities neither had dared to imagine. The kiss lingered just a moment too long to be merely dutiful, and when they broke apart, both were breathing a little faster than decorum dictated. The congregation erupted into applause, partly for the spectacle they had witnessed, partly in genuine relief that disaster had been averted so dramatically. As the newlyweds turned to face their audience, Evangeline caught sight of her parents in the front pew. Her mother was weeping openly, though whether from joy or shock was impossible to tell. Her father looked stunned but relieved, recognizing that his daughter's honor had been salvaged by this miraculous intervention. As they walked back down the aisle together, Alexander's hand steady on her arm, Evangeline began to feel as though she were living in a dream. The faces that had shown pity and scandal-hungry excitement mere minutes ago now displayed amazement and envy. She had gone from ruined woman to duchess in the space of a quarter hour. But as they reached the chapel doors and stepped out into the crisp September air, reality began to reassert itself. She was married to a complete stranger, a man whose reputation was shrouded in mystery and dark whispers. What had she done? What had he done? And more importantly, why? The wedding breakfast proceeded in a haze of congratulations and barely concealed curiosity. The guests, having witnessed the most dramatic wedding in living memory, were determined to extract every detail they could from this unprecedented situation. Alexander handled the attention with practiced ease, his manners perfect, and his responses politely uninformative. "How long have you known Lady Evangeline?" Lady Pemberton, Henry's aunt, asked with barely disguised suspicion. "Long enough to recognize her worth?" Alexander replied smoothly, raising his crystal glass of champagne in a subtle toast to his new wife. "But surely you must have met before today?" pressed Lord Hartwell, one of the most notorious gossips in the county. "The heart recognizes what it needs when it needs it," Alexander said with a slight smile that revealed nothing. "Time is merely a human construct, irrelevant to matters of true importance." Such responses only fueled the gossip, but they were impossible to argue with. Throughout it all, Evangeline found herself watching her new husband with growing fascination. He was clearly intelligent, well-educated, and possessed of a natural authority that made even the most persistent questioners back down. Yet there was something guarded about him, as if he were constantly prepared for attack. When James Whitmore, a young gentleman with laughing blue eyes and disheveled brown hair, approached them during the reception, Alexander's demeanor shifted subtly. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and something that might have been genuine warmth entered his expression. "Alex, you magnificent bastard," James said quietly, clapping Alexander on the shoulder. "Trust you to make the most dramatic entrance possible, though I have to say, your timing was impeccable." "Language, James," Alexander murmured, but there was affection in his voice. "Allow me to present my wife, Lady Evangeline. Evangeline, this disreputable character is James Whitmore, unfortunately one of my closest friends." James bowed elegantly over Evangeline's hand. "Your Grace, may I say that my friend has shown exceptional judgment today? You are radiant, despite the rather unusual circumstances." There was something about James's genuine warmth that put Evangeline at ease for the first time that day. "Mr. Whitmore, I fear I am still quite overwhelmed by everything that has transpired." "Perfectly understandable," James replied with a conspiratorial grin. "Marriage is overwhelming enough under normal circumstances, but I can assure you that despite his forbidding exterior, Alexander is fundamentally decent, mysterious, and occasionally infuriating, but decent." As the afternoon wore on, Evangeline found herself studying the dynamics between Alexander and the other guests. Most treated him with a mixture of respect and wariness, as if he were a magnificent but potentially dangerous animal. She noticed that he never fully relaxed, never let his guard down completely even when speaking with James, who was clearly a trusted friend. But it was when Lord Henry Pemberton finally made his appearance, arriving just as the reception was winding down, that Evangeline saw her new husband's true nature revealed. Henry strode into Ravenshallow's great ballroom as if he owned it, his blonde hair perfectly arranged and his clothing immaculate despite being several hours late for his own wedding. His brown eyes swept the room with cold calculation, taking in the scene before him with what appeared to be amusement rather than remorse. "My sincere apologies for my tardiness," he announced loudly enough for half the room to hear. "I'm afraid pressing business matters detained me. I trust everyone has been entertained in my absence." The audacity of his entrance left many guests speechless. Here was a man who had abandoned his bride at the altar, showing up hours later as if nothing had happened. But before anyone else could respond, Alexander stepped forward. The change in him was immediate and unmistakable. The carefully controlled nobleman vanished, replaced by something far more primitive and dangerous. His eyes became chips of winter ice, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator circling its prey. "Lord Pemberton," Alexander said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent ballroom. "How good of you to join us, though I fear you're rather late for your own wedding." Henry's gaze flicked between Alexander and Evangeline, his expression unreadable. "So I see. And you are?" "Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravencrest, and as of this afternoon Lady Evangeline's husband." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Henry's carefully composed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something ugly beneath. Anger, perhaps, or frustrated greed. But he recovered quickly, pasting on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How fortuitous," he said slowly. "Though I must say it seems rather precipitous to marry a woman one has surely known for mere hours." "Less precipitous than abandoning one's bride on what should have been the happiest day of her life," Alexander replied, his tone conversational but with steel beneath the silk. "Tell me, Pemberton, what business could possibly be more important than honoring one's commitments to a lady?" The entire ballroom held its breath. This was a direct challenge, delivered with the kind of quiet menace that suggested consequences for the wrong answer. Henry seemed to recognize the danger he was in, because his next words were chosen more carefully. "Family emergencies have a way of disrupting even the best-laid plans," he said vaguely. "Though I'm sure Lady Evangeline, forgive me, Your Grace, understands that sometimes duty must supersede personal inclination." "Indeed," Alexander agreed, stepping closer until he towered over the shorter man. "I quite agree that duty is paramount, the duty to honor one's word, the duty to protect those weaker than oneself, the duty to behave with integrity rather than self-interest." Each word was delivered like a precisely placed sword thrust, and Henry's face grew progressively paler. Around them, the other guests watched in fascination as one of society's most notorious rakes was systematically dismantled by a man who radiated barely leashed violence. "Now," Alexander continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow still audible throughout the ballroom. "I believe you owe my wife an apology, a sincere one." Henry looked around the room, perhaps seeking allies or escape routes, but found only expectant faces waiting to see how this drama would conclude. Finally, his gaze landed on Evangeline, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of awe and growing understanding. This was her husband, this dangerous, compelling man who had appeared from nowhere to save her honor and was now defending it with a ferocity that took her breath away. Whatever his reasons for marrying her, whatever secrets he might be hiding, she was beginning to understand that Alexander Blackwood was not a man who would ever abandon those under his protection. "Lady Evangeline," Henry said stiffly, offering a minimal bow, "I regret any inconvenience my absence may have caused. It was grudging and insincere, but it was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing in front of witnesses." Alexander seemed to judge it adequate because he stepped back slightly, though his posture remained alert. "How magnanimous," he said dryly. "Now, I believe your presence is no longer required at this celebration. The door is behind you." Henry's jaw tightened, and for a moment Evangeline thought he might refuse to leave. But something in Alexander's eyes, perhaps the promise of consequences that would extend far beyond this ballroom, made him reconsider. With another stiff bow to the room in general, he turned and strode out of Ravenshollow, leaving whispers and speculation in his wake. As the tension in the room gradually dissipated and conversations resumed, Alexander turned back to Evangeline. The dangerous stranger was gone, replaced once again by the courteous gentleman who had rescued her that morning. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his concern genuine. Evangeline nodded, though she felt anything but all right. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, humiliation, despair, gratitude, confusion, and now something else entirely. Watching Alexander defend her honor with such controlled ferocity had awakened feelings she didn't entirely understand. Henry had never inspired such protective instincts in anyone. Indeed, she was beginning to suspect he would have expected her to defend herself. "Thank you," she said simply, because there were no words adequate to express what he had done for her. Alexander's expression softened slightly. "You have nothing to thank me for. What he did was unconscionable. No lady should ever be subjected to such treatment." As the last of the guests finally departed and the great house settled into evening quiet, Evangeline found herself alone with her new husband in Ravenshallow's library. The room was Alexander's favorite, she had learned. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, comfortable chairs positioned near the fireplace, and tall windows that looked out over the estate's formal gardens. She had changed from her wedding gown into a simpler evening dress of deep blue silk, but she still wore the magnificent emerald ring he had placed on her finger. In the firelight, it caught the flames and threw them back in brilliant green sparks. "Where did you get it?" she asked suddenly, holding up her hand to admire the ring. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Alexander looked up from the brandy he was pouring, his expression unreadable. "It belonged to my mother." The simple statement carried weight that she didn't fully understand. There was pain there, buried deep but still raw enough to make him guard his words carefully. "She must have been very beautiful to wear something so lovely," Evangeline said gently. She was. Alexander handed her a glass of sherry, their fingers brushing briefly as she took it. "She died when I was 12. Consumption." The admission surprised her with its honesty. Throughout the day he had revealed nothing personal about himself, deflecting every inquiry with skillful non-answers. But here, in the quiet intimacy of the library with only the fire for company, he seemed willing to offer small glimpses of the man beneath the title. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "It must have been very difficult." "It was the beginning of many difficulties," he replied, settling into the chair across from hers. In the firelight, the scar above his eyebrow was more pronounced, giving him an almost piratical appearance. "But that's not why I offered you my mother's ring." Evangeline waited, sensing that he was choosing his words carefully. "You deserve something beautiful today," he said finally. "Something worthy of the courage you showed. Not many women would have had the presence of mind to accept help from a complete stranger. Not many complete strangers would have offered it," she countered. "Why did you?" "Really?" Alexander was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. He stared into the fire, his strong profile highlighting the aristocratic lines of his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear him. "Because I know what it feels like to be abandoned by those who should protect you." The words hung between them like a bridge, the first real connection they had made beyond the dramatic circumstances that had thrown them together. Evangeline felt her heart constrict with sympathy for this proud, damaged man who had rescued her from her own abandonment. "Tell me," she said softly. Alexander's laugh was bitter. "That, my dear wife, is a story for another day. Perhaps when we know each other well enough for such confidences." The word wife sent a strange thrill through her, followed immediately by a flutter of nervousness. They were married now, legally and completely. Tonight was their wedding night, and despite the extraordinary circumstances, certain expectations would need to be addressed. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander set down his brandy and fixed her with those penetrating storm-gray eyes. "Evangeline," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her pulse quicken. "I want you to understand something. This marriage may have begun as a rescue, but I will not treat it, or you, as anything less than real. However, I am not such a cad as to demand my husband's rights from a woman who married me out of necessity rather than affection." She felt heat rise in her cheeks at his directness, but also relief that he had broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying that whatever happens between us will happen because we both want it to, not because of legal obligations or social expectations. You've had quite enough of being forced into situations not of your choosing." His consideration touched her more deeply than any romantic declaration might have. Henry had never asked what she wanted, had simply assumed that her compliance was guaranteed. But this mysterious duke, who owed her nothing beyond what he had already given, was offering her the one thing she had never had: choice. "And if we never, she began, then stopped, unable to find words for such an intimate topic. "Then we will have a marriage of companionship and mutual respect," Alexander said calmly. "There are far worse foundations for a union. But Evangeline," he leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight, "I hope that in time we might find something more." The admission sent warmth spiraling through her chest. This wasn't just kindness or duty. This was a man who was genuinely hoping that their strange beginning might lead to something deeper. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. As if sensing her emotional turmoil, Alexander rose from his chair and moved to the window, giving her space to process his words. Outside, the gardens of Raven's Hollow were silver in the moonlight, the maze of roses casting intricate shadows across the manicured lawns. "I've arranged for you to have the Duchess's suite," he said without turning around. "It connects to my rooms but has its own entrance. You'll have complete privacy whenever you need it." Again, his thoughtfulness surprised her. Most husbands would have expected immediate intimacy, regardless of the circumstances. But Alexander was clearly a man who played by his own rules. "Thank you," she said, rising to join him at the window. Standing beside him, she was acutely aware of his height, his presence, the subtle scent of sandalwood that seemed to surround him. "Alexander," she said hesitantly, testing the sound of his name on her lips. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Why aren't you married already? A duke, a war hero, wealthy and—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks again. "And what?" he prompted, amusement coloring his voice. "Handsome," she finished in a rush. "Surely you could have had your pick of brides. Why were you even at Raven's Hollow today? Did you know Lord Pemberton wouldn't appear?" Alexander turned to face her fully, and she saw something shift in his expression, a guardedness returning, walls going up against questions that cut too close to whatever secrets he carried. "I was in the area on business," he said carefully. "As for why I'm not married," he paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "Let's just say that my reputation precedes me in most social circles. The mothers of marriageable daughters tend to steer their offspring away from the cursed Duke of Ravencrest." Cursed? Despite herself, Evangeline felt a thrill of curiosity rather than fear. What nonsense. "Is it?" Alexander's smile was sardonic. "Ask anyone in London society. They'll tell you that tragedy follows in my wake. that anyone who gets too close to me suffers for it. My father, my mother, my younger brother. His voice trailed off, pain flickering across his features before he could hide it. What happened to your brother? Evangeline asked gently. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, he said, "He died in my place." Before she could ask what he meant, Alexander straightened abruptly, the moment of vulnerability vanishing behind his careful mask. But enough of such grim topics, he said, forcing lightness into his tone. This is our wedding night, after all. Perhaps we should focus on more pleasant matters. Evangeline wanted to press him for details, to understand the pain that had carved those lines around his eyes and made him so quick to defend others from abandonment. But she recognized the signs of a man retreating behind emotional walls, and she was wise enough not to pursue him there. Not yet. Instead, she surprised them both by reaching out and placing her hand on his arm. Through the fine fabric of his coat, she could feel the solid warmth of muscle, the subtle tension that suggested he was never completely at ease. "Thank you," she said again. "Not just for today, but for giving me choices, for treating me as more than an obligation." Alexander looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, her auburn hair gleamed with bronze highlights, and her green eyes seemed to hold depths he was only beginning to fathom. "You are far more than an obligation, Evangeline," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. "You are my wife, my responsibility, and if I have my way, something much more precious than either." The intensity of his words, coupled with the heat in his gaze, made her pulse race. This was dangerous territory, the space between gratitude and genuine attraction, between a marriage of convenience and something that might become real. "I should let you rest," Alexander said, stepping back slightly, though his eyes never left her face. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow we'll need to discuss practical matters, where we'll live, how we'll manage our combined households, what we'll tell society about our unusual courtship." Evangeline nodded, though she found herself reluctant to leave the intimacy of the library. Here, with just the firelight and moonlight for company, Alexander seemed more approachable, more human than the commanding figure who had swept into her life that morning. "Good night, Alexander," she said softly. "Good night, wife." As she made her way through the corridors of Raven's Hollow to her new chambers, Evangeline's mind whirled with the events of the day. This morning she had awakened expecting to become Lady Pemberton, trapped in a marriage of duty with a man who had never stirred her heart. Tonight she was the Duchess of Ravencrest, wed to a mysterious stranger who had already shown her more consideration and protection than her previous betrothed ever had. The Duchess's suite was magnificent, a sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold, a bedchamber with a canopied bed large enough for 3 people, and a dressing room that connected to what she assumed were Alexander's quarters. As her lady's maid helped her prepare for bed, Evangeline caught herself listening for sounds from the adjoining rooms, wondering what her enigmatic husband was doing. When she was finally alone, clad in a nightgown of white silk with her auburn hair falling in waves around her shoulders, she moved to the window that looked out over the estate gardens. Somewhere in the darkness, she knew Alexander was probably still awake, perhaps wrestling with his own thoughts about their strange union. The emerald ring caught the moonlight as she raised her hand to the glass. His mother's ring, given to a bride he barely knew, in a gesture of kindness that had probably cost him more emotionally than she could imagine. What kind of man carried such pain, yet still found the strength to rescue someone else from theirs? As she settled into the enormous bed, Evangeline realized that her feelings about this day had undergone a complete transformation. This morning, the thought of marriage had filled her with resigned dread. Tonight she was curious, intrigued, and yes, attracted to the man who had become her husband. Alexander Blackwood was dangerous, damaged, and undoubtedly hiding secrets that might change everything she thought she knew about him. But he was also brave, kind, and honorable in ways that Henry Pemberton had never been. Whatever tomorrow might bring, whatever challenges their unusual marriage might face, Evangeline was beginning to think that being abandoned at the altar might have been the best thing that had ever happened to her. In the room beyond the connecting door, Alexander stood at his own window, a glass of brandy forgotten in his hand as he stared out at the moonlit gardens. His wedding day, something he had never expected to experience, given the dark reputation that followed him like a shadow. Evangeline Ashworth, Blackwood now, he reminded himself, had surprised him at every turn. Her courage in accepting his unprecedented proposal, her grace under impossible circumstances, her gentle questions about his family. She was nothing like the vapid society misses he had encountered in London drawing rooms, but that only made his deception worse. She thought he had been at Ravenshollow by coincidence, that his appearance had been a fortunate accident. In reality, he had been watching Pemberton for weeks, investigating reports that the man was involved in activities that threatened national security. Alexander's presence at the wedding had been entirely intentional, part of a plan to get close to Pemberton and his associates. He had never intended to marry Evangeline. The plan had been to attend as a guest, observe Pemberton's contacts, and gather intelligence. But when he had seen her standing there in the aisle, abandoned and humiliated, something in him had snapped. All thoughts of duty and mission had fled, replaced by a protective instinct so fierce it had surprised him with its intensity. Now he was married to an innocent woman who deserved honesty, while he was bound by oaths that prevented him from telling her the truth about who he really was and what he really did for the crown. The emerald ring on her finger, his mother's ring as he had told her, represented promises he wasn't sure he could keep, given the dangerous nature of his real work. But as he remembered the trust in her green eyes, the way she had defended him against the gossip's whispers, the courage she had shown in the face of public humiliation, Alexander found himself making a silent vow. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever dangers his real work might bring to their door, he would find a way to protect her. She had already suffered enough betrayal for one lifetime. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn mist clinging to the valleys around Ravenshollow like ghostly fingers. Evangeline awoke to the gentle sounds of her lady's maid preparing her morning chocolate and drawing back the heavy curtains. For a moment she lay still in the enormous bed, wondering if the previous day had been an elaborate dream. But the emerald ring on her finger caught the morning light, sending green fire dancing across the ceiling, and she knew that everything had been gloriously, terrifyingly real. She was married to Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravencrest, a man she barely knew, but who had already shown her more protection and consideration than any man in her life. "Good morning, Your Grace," her maid, Sarah, said with barely concealed excitement. The girl had been with the Ashworth family for 3 years, but the prospect of serving a duchess was clearly thrilling. "His Grace sent word that he would be honored to escort you on a tour of the estate this morning, if you're agreeable." Evangeline's pulse quickened at the thought of spending time alone with Alexander. In daylight, away from the drama and chaos of yesterday, perhaps she could begin to understand the man who had become her husband. She chose her clothing carefully, a riding habit of deep forest green that complemented her eyes, her auburn hair arranged in a simple but elegant style beneath a small hat adorned with ostrich feathers. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she was surprised by what she saw. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, more confident perhaps, or simply more alive than she had appeared in months. Alexander was waiting for her in the breakfast room, looking devastatingly handsome in buff-colored breeches and a dark blue coat that emphasized his broad shoulders. He rose as she entered, his bow perfectly correct, but she caught something warmer in his storm-gray eyes as they met hers. "Good morning, wife," he said, and again that word sent an unexpected thrill through her. "I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," she replied, accepting the chair he held for her. The breakfast laid out was magnificent, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, local honey, preserves made from Ravenshallow's own fruit trees, and eggs so fresh they must have been gathered that morning. "I thought you might like to see something of your new home," Alexander said as he resumed his seat across from her. "Ravenshollow has been in my family for 4 generations, though I confess I haven't spent as much time here as I should have in recent years." "What keeps you away?" Evangeline asked, buttering a piece of the warm bread. Even this simple domestic scene felt charged with possibility. 2 people learning each other's rhythms, preferences, the small intimacies that would build into something larger. Alexander's expression grew guarded. "Business in London, mostly. My estates require attention, and there are obligations that keep me occupied." She sensed there was more to it than he was saying, but she had learned enough about her husband to know that direct questioning would only make him retreat behind his walls. Instead, she tried a different approach. "It must be lonely," she said gently. "All that responsibility, with no one to share it." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she had seen past his careful composure to the isolation beneath. "It can be," he admitted, "though I've grown accustomed to solitude." "Well," Evangeline said with a smile that made his breath catch slightly, "you're not alone anymore." The simple statement hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Alexander found himself wondering when this slip of a woman had developed the ability to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses. Their ride through the estate revealed Raven's Hollow to be even more magnificent than Evangeline had realized. Ancient oak trees lined the drive, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and crimson with the approach of autumn. The formal gardens gave way to rolling parkland where deer grazed peacefully, and beyond that, working farms where tenants raised their caps respectfully as the Duke and his new Duchess rode past. "They seem genuinely fond of you," Evangeline observed as they paused on a small hill overlooking the village that served the estate. "I try to be a good landlord," Alexander replied. "These people depend on me for their livelihoods. That's not a responsibility I take lightly." She could hear the sincerity in his voice, see it in the way he acknowledged every person they encountered. This was not a man who viewed his tenants as mere sources of income, but as people whose welfare was his personal concern. As they rode deeper into the estate, Alexander began to relax in ways that surprised them both. Away from the watching eyes of society, mounted on his favorite stallion with the woman who had inexplicably become his wife riding gracefully beside him, he felt some of the constant tension leave his shoulders. "Tell me about your childhood here," Evangeline said as they dismounted near a small lake surrounded by weeping willows. "It was happy for the most part," Alexander said, helping her down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she found herself leaning slightly into his strength. "My brother Charles and I used to fish in this lake, much to our tutor's despair. We were supposed to be studying Latin and mathematics, but the pull of adventure always seemed stronger." "You mentioned your brother yesterday," Evangeline said carefully. "You said he died in your place?" Alexander's expression darkened, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. But then, perhaps influenced by the peaceful setting and her obvious concern, he began to speak. "Charles was 2 years younger than me, but he idolized everything about being the heir to a dukedom. When I bought my commission and went to fight Napoleon, he was furious that he couldn't come with me." Alexander's voice grew rough with old grief. "He was only 16, but he was tall for his age, strong. When a French patrol captured me during a reconnaissance mission, Charles somehow learned of it. He came after me, alone, against direct orders." Evangeline's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. She could see the scene playing out in his mind, a younger brother so desperate to save his hero that he would risk everything. "He managed to free me," Alexander continued, his eyes fixed on the lake where childhood memories seemed to dance on the surface. "But the French were everywhere, and someone had to hold them off while the other escaped. Charles." He stopped, his jaw working as he fought for control. "He chose to stay behind," Evangeline said softly, understanding flooding through her. "He chose to die for me," Alexander corrected harshly. "And he did it with a smile, telling me it was his honor to serve his duke. He was 17 years old, Evangeline. 17, and he died because I was careless enough to get captured in the first place." The anguish in his voice made her heart break for him. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of comfort that surprised them both with its naturalness. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "War is chaos. People die, good people, brave people, and it's never the fault of those who survive to mourn them. Tell that to my father," Alexander said bitterly. "Charles was his favorite, the charming one, the one who could make anyone laugh. When the news reached England, my father, he blamed me, said I should have been the one to die, that Charles was worth 10 of me." "Your father was grieving," Evangeline said, though her heart ached for the young man who had returned from war only to face his father's blame for his brother's heroic sacrifice. "People say terrible things when they're in pain. Perhaps. But he never took the words back. Even on his deathbed 2 years later, his last words to me were that I had stolen the future from a better man. No wonder Alexander carried himself like a man expecting attack, Evangeline thought. No wonder he had appeared in her life like a dark angel, determined to rescue someone else from abandonment. He understood betrayal and loss in ways that most people never would. Your brother chose to save you because you were worth saving, she said, squeezing his hand. A man who would risk everything to rescue a stranger from humiliation, who would give his own mother's ring to a woman he barely knew, who protects his tenants and defends the helpless. That's a man worth any sacrifice. Alexander stared down at their joined hands, stunned by her fierce defense of him. When had anyone ever spoken of him with such conviction, such belief in his worth? Even James, loyal as he was, had never put it quite like that. You don't know me, he said quietly. There are things about me, about my life, that might change your opinion. Then tell me, Evangeline challenged. Trust me with your secrets, Alexander. Let me decide what I can accept. For a moment he was tempted. The weight of his double life, his work for the crown, the constant danger that surrounded him, all of it pressed against his chest like a physical burden. How wonderful it would be to share that load with someone else, to have a partner who understood the costs of the choices he had made. But even as the words formed in his throat, duty reasserted itself. His work was too dangerous, too sensitive, to risk exposing an innocent woman to its consequences. And Evangeline was innocent. He could see it in the way she looked at him, in her willingness to trust despite having every reason to be suspicious. Some secrets aren't mine to tell, he said instead, hating himself for the disappointment that flickered across her features. But Evangeline was more resilient than he gave her credit for. Instead of pressing him or withdrawing in hurt, she simply nodded and changed the subject. Tell me about the house, she said. What was it like growing up in such a grand place? Grateful for her understanding, Alexander began to share stories of his childhood, midnight raids on the kitchens with Charles, elaborate games of hide-and-seek that could last for hours in Ravens Hollow's numerous rooms, the Christmas celebrations that had filled the great hall with laughter and music. As they walked around the lake, Evangeline found herself falling a little more under his spell with each story. This was the man beneath the mysterious Duke, someone who had been deeply loved and who had loved deeply in return, before loss and duty had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. You should have that again, she said impulsively as they paused beneath a particularly ancient oak tree. The laughter, the music, the family gatherings. Ravens Hollow is too beautiful to be lonely. Alexander looked down at her, struck by the wistfulness in her voice. Is that what you want? A house full of children and chaos? Color rose in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. I want whatever makes you happy, she said honestly. Yesterday you gave me back my life. If I can give you back your joy, it seems like a fair exchange. The words hit him like a physical blow. Here was this woman, married to him barely 24 hours ago out of desperation rather than love, offering to help him reclaim something he hadn't even realized he'd lost. The generosity of it, the pure selflessness, made his chest tight with emotions he didn't know how to name. Without conscious thought, he reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the delicate line of her cheekbones. Her skin was soft as silk, warm beneath his touch, and her green eyes widened at the sudden intimacy. Evangeline, he said, her name a prayer on his lips. Yes? I'm going to kiss you now. Not because we're married, not because anyone expects it, but because I want to. Because you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, and I can't stop thinking about how you felt in my arms yesterday. Her breath caught, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything between them. Yes, she whispered. This time, when his lips met hers, there was nothing ceremonial about it. This was a kiss born of genuine desire, of recognition, of two wounded souls finding unexpected solace in each other. Alexander's mouth was firm and warm against hers, demanding yet gentle, coaxing responses from her that she hadn't known she was capable of. Evangeline had been kissed before, chaste, proper kisses from Henry during their courtship that had left her feeling nothing but mild distaste. But this was fire and electricity, Want and need wrapped together in a sensation that made her knees weak and her heart race like a runaway horse. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face as if she might disappear if he let go. "I should apologize," he said roughly. "If you do, I'll never forgive you," Evangeline replied, surprising them both with her vehemence. His laugh was shaky, but genuine. "In that case, I regret nothing." They rode back to Ravens Hollow in a state of heightened awareness, every accidental touch sending sparks between them. The easy camaraderie of the morning had transformed into something deeper, more charged with possibility. By the time they reached the stables, the very air seemed to hum with tension. "I have some correspondence to attend to," Alexander said as they dismounted, though his eyes never left her face. "Business matters that can't be delayed. But perhaps you would join me for dinner tonight? Just the two of us?" "I would like that very much," Evangeline replied, and the smile that spread across her face made his heart skip several beats. As she walked back toward the house, Alexander found himself watching the graceful sway of her hips, the way the afternoon sunlight turned her auburn hair to flame. His wife. The thought still seemed surreal, but increasingly pleasant. The correspondence he had mentioned was real enough, coded messages from London that required his immediate attention. But as he settled into his study to decode the latest intelligence reports, Alexander found his thoughts constantly drifting to emerald eyes and the taste of innocence on his lips. The reports were troubling. Lord Pemberton, it seemed, had not given up his pursuit of Evangeline even after the humiliation of the previous day. More concerning, he had been spotted meeting with known French agents in a tavern on the outskirts of London. The implications were clear. Whatever had driven Pemberton to abandon his wealthy bride at the altar had been worth risking treason charges. Alexander's jaw tightened as he read the details. His marriage to Evangeline had been impulsive, driven by protective instincts rather than strategic thinking. But it seemed that fate had placed him exactly where he needed to be to protect both his new wife and England's interests. The question was whether he could do both without sacrificing one for the other. Meanwhile, Evangeline was discovering the reality of being mistress of a great house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, had approached her with deference but also with genuine warmth, eager to share the responsibilities she had been carrying alone for too long. "His Grace has been too much alone these past years," the older woman confided as they toured the main rooms. "It's good to see Ravens Hollow have a proper mistress again." The house has been waiting for laughter. As they walked through room after magnificent room, Evangeline began to understand the scope of what Alexander had offered her. This wasn't just marriage. It was partnership in managing one of England's great estates, responsibility for dozens of servants and hundreds of tenants, a chance to make a real difference in the world. The Christmas festivities used to be legendary, Mrs. Morrison continued as they entered the Great Hall. The entire village would come up to the house for the Boxing Day celebration. But since the old Duke died, there haven't been any celebrations, Evangeline finished, her heart aching for all the joy that had been lost to grief and guilt. "Perhaps this year might be different," Mrs. Morrison suggested hopefully. Evangeline looked around the hall, imagining it decorated with garlands and filled with music and laughter. The idea of bringing life back to Ravens Hollow, of giving Alexander back some of the happiness he had lost, filled her with determination. Perhaps it might, she agreed. That evening, as she prepared for her private dinner with Alexander, Evangeline chose her clothing with unusual care. The gown was one of her finest, deep burgundy silk that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair and made her green eyes seem to glow. Her lady's maid had arranged her hair in an elegant upswept style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck, and she wore the emerald necklace that matched her wedding ring. When she entered the small dining room Alexander had chosen for their meal, she was gratified to see his eyes widen with appreciation. "You look magnificent," he said, rising to pull out her chair. The simple compliment, delivered with obvious sincerity, sent warmth flooding through her. "Thank you," she replied, acutely aware of his proximity as he seated her. He had changed into evening wear, a perfectly cut black coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt that contrasted beautifully with his dark hair. The small scar above his eyebrow gave him a rakish air that made her pulse quicken. The meal was intimate in ways that surprised them both. Alexander had clearly instructed the servants to minimize interruptions, and they found themselves talking freely about everything from books to politics to their shared love of horses. Evangeline discovered that her mysterious husband was remarkably well-read, with opinions on everything from the latest novels to the economic theories gaining popularity in Parliament. "You disagree with me," Alexander observed with amusement as they debated the merits of various poets over the fish course. "I disagree with your assessment of Lord Byron," Evangeline corrected. "His poetry may be technically proficient, but it lacks the emotional truth of someone like William Blake." "Emotional truth?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying their spirited discussion. "An interesting phrase. You think poetry should reveal the poet's soul?" "I think poetry should reveal something universal about the human condition," Evangeline replied, warming to her theme. "What good is technical perfection if it doesn't make us feel something real?" Alexander found himself studying her animated face, the way her eyes lit up when she was passionate about something. Henry Pemberton was an even bigger fool than he had thought, to abandon such a woman for mere money. "And what do you feel when you read Blake?" he asked. "Recognition," she said simply. "He writes about darkness and light, about the struggle between innocence and experience. He understands that life is complicated, that we all carry both angels and demons within us." The words hit closer to home than she could possibly know. Alexander's life was nothing but complications, light and dark tangled together in ways that sometimes left him unsure which was which. "And which do you carry more of?" he asked quietly. "Angels or demons?" Evangeline considered the question seriously. "I used to think I was all angels," she said finally. "But yesterday, when I wanted to slap Henry Pemberton in front of 300 guests, I discovered I have rather more demons than I realized." Alexander's laugh was genuine and delighted. "My dear wife, the fact that you only wanted to slap him proves you're still predominantly angelic. I had much darker impulses regarding Lord Pemberton." "Such as?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw something shift in Alexander's expression. A hardness that reminded her she was married to a man who had seen war, who carried secrets she couldn't begin to imagine, such as ensuring he never had the opportunity to humiliate another innocent woman. He said, his voice carrying undertones that made her shiver. It wasn't an idle threat, she realized. Alexander Blackwood was a man capable of making good on his promises, whether they involved protection or retribution. The knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it sent an unexpected thrill through her. To be protected by someone so clearly dangerous, so completely capable of defending what was his. "Would you really have challenged him to a duel?" she asked. "If necessary." Alexander's eyes met hers across the table. "You're under my protection now, Evangeline. That's not a responsibility I take lightly." The possessiveness in his voice, the absolute certainty with which he claimed her as his to protect, should have offended her independent spirit. Instead, it made heat pool low in her belly and her pulse race with something that was definitely not fear. As the evening progressed, the conversation grew more personal, more intimate. Alexander found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, memories of his mother, dreams he had harbored as a young man before duty and loss had shaped him into something harder. Evangeline, in turn, revealed her own struggles with the limitations placed on women of her class, her secret dreams of travel and adventure, her longing for a purpose beyond being a decorative wife to some titled gentleman. "What would you do?" Alexander asked as they lingered over wine in the last course. "If you could do anything at all, regardless of social expectations." "Travel," she said immediately. "See the world beyond England's shores. Learn about different cultures, different ways of thinking. Maybe write about it, help other women understand that there's more to life than drawing rooms and morning calls." Alexander found himself imagining taking her to the exotic places his work had brought him. The ancient cities of the Ottoman Empire, the sun-baked ports of the Mediterranean, the mysterious courts of distant kingdoms. The image of Evangeline exploring those places with her characteristic blend of courage and curiosity was surprisingly appealing. "Perhaps we could travel together," he said carefully. "Once certain obligations are resolved." "What obligations?" she asked, but gently, without the pressure that would make him retreat. Alexander was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were chosen with obvious care. "I have debts," he said finally. "Not financial ones, but debts of honor. People are depending on me to see certain matters through to their conclusion. But when that's done," he looked at her across the table, his storm-gray eyes intense with promises he couldn't yet voice. "When that's done, perhaps we could see about making some of your dreams come true." The careful phrasing told her that whatever these obligations were, they were both important and dangerous. But the promise implicit in his words, that he saw their marriage as having a future beyond mere convenience, made her heart skip with hope. As the evening wound down and they made their way back through Ravens Hollow's corridors, the tension between them was palpable. At the door to her chambers they paused, neither quite ready to end an evening that had revealed so much about each other. "Thank you," Evangeline said softly, "for today, for tonight, for showing me who you really are." "And who am I?" Alexander asked, stepping closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Someone worth waiting for," she replied, her honesty surprising them both. Alexander's control, already strained by hours of watching her animated face across the dinner table, finally snapped. This time when he kissed her, there was nothing gentle about it. This was hunger and need and the promise of what could be between them if they were brave enough to reach for it. Evangeline melted into him, her hands fisting in the lapels of his coat as she kissed him back with a passion that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and trembling with the force of what was building between them. "Evangeline," Alexander said, her name rough with desire. "Yes? I want you to be sure. Whatever happens between us, I want it to be your choice, freely made." She looked up at him, this mysterious honorable man who had rescued her from ruin and was now offering her the chance to choose her own fate. The boy who had lost his brother, the soldier who carried scars both visible and hidden, the duke who protected everyone but himself. She was falling in love with all of him, secrets and all. "I'm sure," she whispered. What followed was a wedding night neither of them would ever forget. Tender and passionate, careful and desperate, two souls finding solace and completion in each other despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. In the darkness of her chambers, with only moonlight and firelight to illuminate their joined bodies, Evangeline discovered that marriage could be more than duty, that desire could coexist with respect, that love could bloom even in the most unlikely soil. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the great canopied bed, Alexander traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder while she dozed against his chest. For the first time in years, he felt something approaching peace. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, whatever secrets still lay between them, this was real. She was real. And for now that was enough. But peace, as Alexander had learned through hard experience, was always temporary. Even as he held his new wife close and allowed himself to believe in the possibility of happiness, forces were already moving that would test everything they had begun to build together. In London, Lord Henry Pemberton sat in his darkened study, staring at a letter that had arrived with the evening post. The seal was French, the contents treasonous, and the payment offered for a specific piece of information was enough to solve all his financial problems permanently. All he had to do was find a way to get close to the Duke of Ravencrest and discover what the Crown's most effective intelligence agent knew about French operations in England. The fact that doing so would also allow him to reclaim the bride who had slipped through his fingers was simply an added benefit. Henry smiled as he fed the letter to the flames dancing in his fireplace. Let the mysterious Duke enjoy his stolen bride while he could. Soon enough, Pemberton would have his revenge, his money, and his woman back. After all, everyone knew that the Duke of Ravencrest was cursed. It was only a matter of time before tragedy struck again, and when it did, Henry would be there to comfort the grieving widow. The game, as they said, was afoot, but Henry Pemberton had underestimated his opponents. In the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened into winter and the first snows began to dust the hills around Ravens Hollow, Alexander and Evangeline's marriage grew stronger with each passing day. What had begun as a rescue had blossomed into genuine love, built on mutual respect, shared laughter, and the kind of passion that burned steady and true. Alexander's mysterious obligations gradually resolved themselves as he and his network of agents systematically dismantled the French spy ring that had been operating in England. Henry Pemberton, attempting to play both sides against the middle, found himself caught in a web of his own making when his treasonous activities were exposed. The man who had abandoned one bride at the altar would spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, his titles stripped, his fortune forfeit to the crown. Justice, Evangeline reflected as she read the news of Henry's arrest in the London papers, had a poetic symmetry to it. By Christmas, Ravenshollow had indeed been restored to its former glory. The great hall rang with laughter and music as the entire village celebrated together, just as it had in the old Duke's time. Children raced through the corridors playing elaborate games of hide-and-seek, while their parents danced to the music of a string quartet in the ballroom. Alexander and Evangeline stood together on the gallery overlooking the festivities, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. The emerald ring on her finger caught the light from 1,000 candles, throwing green fire across the walls like captured starlight. "Happy?" Alexander asked, his arm tightening around her waist. "Gloriously," Evangeline replied, leaning into his warmth. "Though I have to admit I never imagined that being abandoned at the altar would lead to this. The best things in life often come from the most unexpected places," Alexander said, pressing a kiss to her temple. After all, who would have thought that a cursed duke and a ruined bride could find their happily ever after? Below them, the celebration continued long into the night, but Alexander and Evangeline slipped away to their private chambers, where they made their own celebration by the fire. In each other's arms, they had found everything they had never dared to hope for: love, partnership, a future bright with promise. The Duke of Ravencrest was cursed no longer. He had found his salvation in the green eyes of a woman brave enough to say yes when he asked her to trust him with her life. And Lady Evangeline had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with careful planning, but with the courage to step into the unknown with someone worthy of the leap. Their story would become legend in Devonshire, the tale of the mysterious duke who appeared from nowhere to claim his bride, and the woman strong enough to see past his shadows to the light within. Future generations would walk through Ravenshallow's gardens and hear whispers of their great love story, a reminder that even in the darkest moments hope could arrive when least expected. And in the village church where they had married under such extraordinary circumstances, their portrait hung beside those of Alexander's ancestors, two faces looking out with eyes full of love and the quiet confidence of those who had found their perfect match against all odds. For theirs was a love story that proved the old adage true, that the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth the courage it takes to say yes when destiny calls.